Hey everybody, it's been a while since I made a solo video like this. Today I'm going to be talking about the chart of Michael Jackson, mainly in light of the documentary that was recently released on him, which was apparently pretty damning. I didn't see the documentary, but I think you can probably guess what I want to address in this video and why I'm going to address it, even though it doesn't give me any great joy to do so because I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan. And even in spite of his horrible transgressions, molesting kids and whatnot, there's still some part of me that loves the man and his music, and maybe I should say what he originally was, not what he became, which was a fairly disfigured individual in more ways than one, sadly. Anyway, before I launch into it, please check out my website for individual services and more. I've also got a Patreon page where you can contribute to the work I'm doing, my videos, and my blog. I also have a blog as well now, just like a site dedicated only to my writings. So I'll be linking that all here. And yeah, otherwise, please hit like and subscribe if you find value in this video. It's not the most fun topic, it's difficult for me to even do this because I admit, like I admitted already, I'm a huge fan of Michael Jackson and his music and whatnot. And I never wanted to believe that he did these things growing up and whatnot. But yeah, in light of the documentary coming out and apparently being pretty damning, I read a short article reviewing it. I thought I would take a look at the traditional astrology of his chart and see if his chart does show the possibility to molest young boys. And unfortunately, my conclusion at this point in time is that it does. Now, you'll notice that I don't have any houses here, and that's because Michael Jackson's birth time is pretty much unknown. People have rectified it and whatnot, but I haven't considered the research for the rectification or anything. So I'm just going to do what I usually do when there's no reliable birth time and read from the moon, do whole sign houses from the moon, which works extraordinarily well for those of you who have never used it. So we just start with the moon, and then the moon sign is the first house, Aries is the second, Taurus is the third, and so on all the way around till we've got all 12 houses at our disposal. And honestly, it's just amazing because it's another situation where, again, I don't know what his rising sign is. There is a birth chart out there with Pisces rising, but we just don't know for sure. But every time I do these moon chart readings, these moon ascendant readings, it's always incredibly accurate, and sometimes more accurate than the ascendant, if you can believe that. And before I launch into this, I'll just say a little bit more about that. Basically, the moon is, the inner world, our mind, our feelings, right? It's really kind of the seat of the what we might call the personality self, or the personal ego, right? With all our attachments and appetites and desire for comforts and security. And, it's sort of the part of us that gets offended, you might say, as well, or even attaches to this or that ideology or way of being. And that's kind of the lower level of the moon. There's a higher expression of the moon in each planet. Higher and lower are not great words, but it's all I got for right now. So, anyway, just bear with me. So a lot of Westerners practicing Indian astrology and traditional astrology try to look at this as like, oh, well, the moon is just what's in our mind. It's just what's in our mind. But the thing is if we actually study the tradition, we find that the entire chart is a symbol for not only what's in life, but also what's in our mind. Yes, the moon is about our mind, as what I explained before, like the sensory input mind, the totality of the sort of self aspect that thinks of itself as I. But being that all the ancient wisdom traditions tell us that from our mind, all things are created. And in fact, there's really only one mind, and we all sort of in an illusory manner, we all take part in that and have seemingly individual minds. So really, there's no difference between mind and quote unquote the reality out there. There really isn't. So the fact of the matter is, a lot of Westerners would like to say, oh, no, the moon, reading the chart from the moon, that's just what's in our mind only. That's not reality. But actually, it is reality. And if you watch my chart where I analyze Lady Gaga's chart using the moon ascendant, because again, the birth time is unknown, you'll find that all the configurations and the special yogas and things and whatnot, they all exist from the moon, and they mirror her actual life extraordinarily well. So putting that aside, okay, I'm gonna read from the moon chart, and the main house of sex and sexuality is not the 5th house. Okay, that's an erroneous notion. It doesn't have a foundation in classical texts, so I don't know why that became the case. You know, and I'm not saying it doesn't work. Sometimes the 5th house does symbolize sex because it symbolizes risk and creativity and passion and stuff like that, and it is the joy of Venus for those who follow traditional astrology, but it's not traditionally the house of sex. The 7th house is traditionally the house of sex. The 7th house is the house of union with another person, which is why it also refers to marriage. Now in Jyotish, okay, which is you know, has many wonderful insights that we should be adapting to other forms of astrology, like I often do. The 3rd house has a lot to do with desires of all kinds, but especially desires for sort of superfluous entertainments and things like that. So it can also mean sexual desires, but not necessarily at like a deep visceral level, but just kind of like the desire for, you know, that the sensual titillation that sex brings and whatnot. And the 12th house signifies bed pleasures, basically meaning orgasm, because the 12th is a moksha house where you dissolve your consciousness in bliss, and orgasm is like a mini kind of blissful experience. It's a very gross type of samadhi in a sense. And I don't mean gross as in ew, that's gross. I mean gross as in like dense, earthy, bodily, you know, and very temporal, right? An orgasm only lasts a very short while typically. So, okay, so we're going to look at those houses. We're also going to look at the moon, since the moon signifies appetites in general. And of course, we look at Venus, the natural planet of sex. And to a certain degree, we also want to look at Mars as well, especially when Mars and Venus combine in some sort of way, which they do here pretty strongly, actually. So we don't know if this is a day or a night chart. So whatever, we don't, you know, we're not going to use that. But what we do find is, if we start with the 7th house right away, it's ruled by Mercury. And Mercury and the Sun are actually exchanging signs. And not only that, but Mercury's retrograde, and the Sun is in the bounds of Mercury. So the Sun is very mercurial, right? The Sun is a masculine planet. It yields masculine people and things typically in life when we're analyzing it in a birth chart. It's not a gender thing. It's just a practical thing, okay? So already we have this like masculine kind of thing set up, okay? Now I'm going to read from Bonatti, the Liber Astronomiae, where he talks quite a bit about the natives' venereal act. This is chapter 2, treatise 9, page 1289 of Ben Dykes' translation, entitled On the Natives' Manner of the Venereal Act. And typically what we find is that basically a combination of Venus, Mercury, and Saturn will indicate the filthiness of the natives' sexual intercourse. So what Bonatti says is, basically, if Venus were in Capricorn or Aquarius and Saturn were in Taurus or Libra, or if Venus were in Gemini or Virgo and Mercury in Taurus or Libra, or Venus and Mercury were in Capricorn and Aquarius and they were joined together and one was seeking the conjunction of the other, it signifies the filthiness of the native sexual intercourse and is being engaged in sodomitical vice. And he will delight more in the filthy sexual intercourse of men than in that of women. And then later on, Bonatti quotes Umar al-Tabari, an earlier astrologer, saying, if Venus and the Sun and a few other significators, right, were basically in Aries or Leo or Libra or Capricorn, which are those signifying stinking or foul intercourse. It signifies the native is going to be overflowing in sexual intercourse with a shameful and filthy overflowing. So we find that Mercury rules the seventh. Mercury is together with Venus in a fairly close applying conjunction because Mercury is retrograde. Mercury's retrograde, which means there's something funky about him. There's something odd. There's something that goes against the natural flow of things. And they're in the sun sign, right, which is one of those signs listed here for filthy intercourse. Not only that, but Venus and Mercury are both very closely trine to Saturn. Okay, which is another planet, like I said before when I read it, right? It indicates filthy intercourse. And you got to understand, too, in the Middle Ages, this meant pretty much anything that was taboo. So it's not always going to be a combination that means child molesters. Sometimes it could be people that are like really into like very, very kinky, weird stuff like BDSM. Sorry, I don't mean to call it weird. I just mean it's uncommon. You know, it's weird to the average person. So BDSM kind of stuff, you know, and everything that goes with that. You know, or some really nasty, messed up stuff too. That's not appropriate in any sense of the word, you know, like people who abuse women. And okay, anyway, so, but we also find that Mars is square to Venus and Mercury, right? So Mars is going to from a Venusian sign, right? So Mars is going to increase all these things as well, because in the beginning of this chapter, he also talks about Venus and Mars exchanging signs and says this signifies an excess of venereal cultivation, going to abound in the native, an impediment in his person, and the destruction of his matters because of that. So in the footnote, it says this, that Abu Ali, who Bonatti's drawing from, says that this configuration shows an abundance of wives. So basically, the idea is that the person keeps getting divorces, their marriages keep ending badly because of their, you know, their vices, and they're overflowing in sexual matters, and that basically their sex life could ruin their reputation possibly, and stuff like that too. Okay, and we do have a configuration for that where the sun is naturally reputation, right, and its dispositor is afflicted by Mars. Okay, and its dispositor is the seventh lord and joined to Venus. So we kind of have this repetition here of like marriage scandals and sexual scandal building up, right? And this is why traditional methods can be kind of scary, because you can, if you really know what you're doing, you can really see this stuff for real. You know, I mean, I'm obviously looking at it after the fact, but if you really know what you're doing and you're tuned in, you can really see this stuff when you look at a person's chart and you go, oh, this person, wow, this person might be really into sodomy, or this person might be really into little boys or little girls or something like that, right? I don't typically look for that. I would only look for that if I just sensed there was something really off about the person I was reading for. But then I don't even know what I would do with that information. I mean, would I say something about it? I don't know. But the point being is you can really see this stuff. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, right? I mentioned Mercury first, and I didn't fully explain myself in that, okay? I mentioned Mercury first. And right before I go more into Mercury, I want to say that Venus and Mercury are in the sixth house, which is a dark house, which is a hidden house, right? So it's one of the hidden parts of the horoscope, okay? And it's interesting, too, that he has the sun in the seventh, because that means like his fame and his stardom was somehow covering up his marital life and sex life on some level. It was like hidden beneath that, right? The sun, just like the sun makes planets combust and hides them in the night sky, the sun is like such a blinding light wherever it is in the horoscope in a house, right? That like people can't see that. They can only see like the stardom, or they can only see this like solar image. It's like hiding everything. And that might go for the person as well sometimes. But in any case, this is where it gets pretty specific, right? Later on in this chapter, later on in this chapter, Bonatti says, and Umar al-Tabari said, if Mercury were the This is called the victor, but don't worry about that. Anyway, if Mercury were the victor over Venus and the moon and the house of wives, which is the seventh, or over a portion of them or over more of them, the enjoyment of the native will be in boys, and he will delight in deceiving them. Will be in boys, okay? Mercury rules over little boys, and I think partly because if you ever really observe young little boys, okay, they are very androgynous, just like Mercury. I once mistook a young little boy for a little girl because he had this really long hair, and at that age, yeah, it's really interesting. It's just really interesting. Little boys really do sometimes look very androgynous, and they would look even more androgynous if we dressed them the way we used to before maybe like the turn of the century or so. We used to dress girls and boys in like kind of like a dress growing up. All girls and boys would wear these dresses, and there wouldn't be such a sharp divide between the genders. So, you can imagine little boys looking like that and whatnot. So, after a certain age, they start to look like boys. And I think that Michael Jackson was probably, specifically very into boys. I don't think he was, I don't think there was something about them being androgynous that he was attracted to, though there could have been, but he was into boys. So, or so this documentary alleges. And, I hate to say it, but the chart really looks like that's probably the case, as much as I don't want to believe it, being, a longtime fan. But, we have to see what's real, not what we want to be there. So I'm doing my best to point that out, because I looked at his chart after the documentary came out, and I read about it because I wanted to see, well, will the astrology confirm the documentary? And it seems to be confirming it. Okay, so that's a major thing. So we're building a case for, I don't think he committed sodomy, but the point is he committed. You have to remember, like, sodomy has always been looked upon as like really, really bad, really damning, really taboo. So when these authors say sodomy, it's kind of just like something really unnatural is what they're, I think, getting at, more than literal sodomy. Although it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of times it is literal sodomy. But my specialty isn't running around analyzing charts to look for sodomy. Okay, that would be a really weird thing to do. Anyway, okay. So the point is, as I continue to say, as I continue to look for stuff. Okay, the idea too here is that what I want to point out is basically that there's another passage that I need to find and read. Okay. Okay, here we go. This is important. So if Mars and Venus are joined together, no, that's not it. Sorry. Here we go. Which if each Mars and Venus were Oriental, the native will be inclined to do it with men more than with women. Okay, so that's the case here. Okay, Venus and Mars are Oriental, meaning they're going to rise over the horizon before the sun would on that given day of the birth. Okay, now I have Venus and Mars Oriental, and I'm not into men sexually or romantically. Okay. And so not everybody that has this is going to be, wanting to have sex with men or whatever. It's not quite that cut and dry, but it does add to our testimony that's building up here. Okay. So then if the aforesaid planets appeared Oriental and in masculine signs, and Mars were stronger than Venus, and she were more remote from the sun, the native will postpone women in every way for men, and he will concern himself with engaging foully in venereal acts, sodomitically with men. So what that means is that basically if Mars and Venus are Oriental, in a masculine sign, probably in a day chart, or at least on the opposite, or on the same side of the horizon as the sun, which we don't know if that's the case here totally, but and if basically Mars were here in between Venus and the sun, that's what this is really talking about, in my opinion. So that's when there's a greater chance that the person will be homosexual. Okay, so it's not just if they're Oriental, it's also that kind of thing. That really adds to it, makes it more likely. Okay, so so now I am kind of taking a leap with that and saying that based on Bonatti's earlier comments, which he's drawing from earlier authors, right, that if Mercury is in between Venus and the sun like it is here, then doesn't that, and the other conditions are met that he mentions, right, Saturn aspecting, being in a sign like Leo or Capricorn, as they are here in Leo, right, and even Mars getting into the mix, doesn't that logically suggest that that would be small boys or young boys, right? If Mars would make it wanting men, I would think Mercury would make it wanting young boys. So, and I think it makes a lot of sense here too that Mercury is retrograde. It's in the bounds of Mars and in the sign of the sun. And, you know, it may still be combust. I'm not totally sure. That's only about 11 degrees. Mercury could still be technically hidden very easily from the sun, and they're exchanging signs, and Mercury is the seventh lord. So all these things stacking up. For those of you who don't know, when Mercury and Mars come together in a certain way, right, especially like here where it's a square, for example, and Mars doesn't have, you know, necessarily the greatest dignity. He doesn't have any dignity really. This is a situation that can create you know, people who are dishonest, people who are manipulative, people who lie and whatnot. And that's something that Michael Jackson did do if you read about or watch the film with regard to this stuff. So that's the main thing that I saw. And of course, I saw this all very quickly, and then I double checked the book to make sure what I was seeing was correct from what I remembered. And of course, I was like, damn, I think he really did do this, unfortunately. And I thought it'd be, you know, educational at least to make this video, even though it doesn't really make me happy that this is the case. But I wanted to add a couple more things, right? Saturn is squaring the moon very closely, very powerfully, right? She potentially even applies to him, assuming the birth time isn't too far off from this. And, you know, that's a situation in which the person's appetites are, they're going to have like a hole in their heart in a sense. And their appetites become about filling that hole. Their appetites become about filling that lack. Their appetites come from a place of oppression, depression, of abuse. And that's very much the case for Michael Jackson growing up. His father was very abusive, and his brothers would have sex with women while he was in the room and tell him to shut his eyes. So there was emotional, physical, and sexual abuse very much present for him while he was growing up. It's very sad, actually, very sad story. And of course, you know, he disfigured himself quite a bit, and that's physically, and that's going to be shown by Jupiter in the 8th with Rahu, because it's ruling the ascendant. I'll talk about that in a moment. But in any case, we have this Saturn aspect in this moon, so that also adds to very taboo, secretive, not quite right or not quite acceptable sexual desires or appetites in general about the world. This isn't always a bad thing. It doesn't always mean the person is doing bad or evil things. It just means that in general, they're going to be drawn to pleasures and things that are not quite always socially acceptable, you know, that people look down upon. And like I said, sometimes those things are actually perfectly fine, and they're more fine than what is socially acceptable. Not in this case, obviously, because we have all this other testimony backing up, you know, the molestation and stuff. So I just want to make that clear. Context is really important. Now, yeah, Jupiter with Rahu in the 8th, right? This is a person who rejects themselves. That is like constantly upset with themselves for whatever reason, trying to really understand themselves, trying to go above and beyond, and sort of always escape themselves for sure. And, you know, the mutilation of the body makes a lot of sense here, especially since we also have Jupiter in the bounds of Mars. Now, given that Jupiter's in the bounds of Mars, not having good dignity, and occidental from the sun, which also diminishes his power, and with the north node, which in this case I think is actually really afflicting Jupiter, especially because they're both in the 8th, right? This is something that, again, brings up the theme of perverse sexual desires or vibes, right? Because the 8th house does have a lot to do with sex, even if it's not necessarily the sexual act. It has to do with the sexual energy. And so there's kind of an obsession there with sexual energy and whatnot. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that Saturn is the 12th lord. Like I talked about the 12th house earlier, right? So the house of like bliss and escapism and orgasm, right? So Saturn is creating a desire for orgasm that's not, again, not quite kosher, not quite right. It's still not as bad as Jeffrey Dahmer, who had Rahu in the 12th and did really horrific things with orgasm, like bashing in a bartender's brains with a bowling ball and then masturbating over the corpse. So it can get much more horrific than this, of course. But this is pretty bad. Okay, this is not great stuff, right? And also that Venus is the 3rd lord, which again, we talked about the 3rd house being about desire, about entertainments, about going after just desire in general, right? So having Mars there and Venus there with Mercury square to Mars, all square to Mars, this makes a person, really constantly wanting to have fun, escape into pleasures and things like that. And in this case, it's kind of perverse stuff because of everything we've been mentioning and so on. So, and then the final thing is that Jupiter, this kind of afflicted Jupiter, makes a sextile to Mercury, and you think, oh, it's just a sextile, what harm can it do? But Jupiter has a tendency to increase things. And if Jupiter's in very good condition, right, it can moderate things. If it's in like a sextile, trine, or even conjunction. But if it's not in great condition like it is here, and there's no real reception happening, at least to Mercury, right, it just increases the stuff. It just increases it, just blows it up, right? Makes it easier to obtain, right? Where Saturn says no, Saturn frustrates him. Saturn aspects the moon, frustrates him. His ascendant lord is in the 8th. This is frustrated. He's deprived. There's a hole in his heart. He can't ever get what he really wants, which is why he keeps disfiguring himself physically, disfiguring his nose, because his father used to make fun of him for having a quote unquote big nose. So he can't ever get what he wants, really. So, but what does he do? He gets some relief through this Mercury-Venus configuration, and Jupiter makes that easy to obtain. So it's a very sad story. This is a man I deeply love, despite all of his faults. I love his music, and I still believe, okay, this may be a controversial thing to say, but I still believe that there was goodness in him. But that, unfortunately, it got really disfigured to the point of maybe not even being there anymore, in, I don't know, the years before he died or something. I think at some point he lost his soul, so to speak, for sure. But, who he really was a beautiful, sweet, talented soul. And so, yeah. Okay. Anyway, before I start bawling here, thanks for tuning in. If you made it this far, that's awesome. Again, please check out my Patreon and my website and my blog, and share this video and stuff, and find me on Facebook, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more about this chart or ask more questions. So otherwise, have a great day or night or whatever it is for you. Okay. See you guys.